Hello and welcome. While the D-Day store is closed at the moment, we thought that we'd take you on a virtual tour of the museum and show you some of the displays and some of the highlights that you can see at the museum. My name's James Daly and I'm one of the curators who helped to put the museum together. We're going to start off today having a look at some of the preparations for D-Day. Obviously D-Day is such a huge operation, one of the biggest military operations in history. Obviously that couldn't happen overnight. It took years and years of planning by many people in different places, and a lot of this happened in Britain, on the south coast of England and around Portsmouth, so it's very important to our museum. Right, so after you've bought your ticket and you've come into the museum, the displays start in Dunkirk in 1940, when the Allied armies were evacuated from northern France, and they knew that sooner or later they'd have to go back and land in Western Europe to defeat Nazi Germany and win the Second World War. In this part of the museum, the objects that are on display are from campaigns between 1940 and 1944. We've got objects that relate to Dunkirk, from the campaign in North Africa, the bomber offensive, the war in Italy, the Blitz, and one object that you can see is a violin. This was owned by a Polish soldier who came from Poland in 1940 to France and then Britain, called Tadeusz Kubica, and one of the only possessions that he brought with him was this violin. And later in 1944 he landed in Normandy with the Polish Armoured Division and again took this violin with him, so it's a really interesting personal object that tells his story of how he came from Poland to France to Britain and then back to France again. So that's one thing that you'll notice all the way through the museum, is that most of our objects relate to a person. D-Day is overwhelmingly a story that's all about people, and people from all sorts of different backgrounds and ways of life. Also in this part of the museum are displays about the process of choosing where to land. The Allies had to decide where in France, or indeed in the rest of Europe, where to land, and to do that they had to work out what the defences were like in different parts of France. The choice really fell between the Pas de Calais, around Calais and Boulogne, or the Normandy beaches. One of the ways that the Allies did this was to gather information, so geologists built up a picture of what the soil looked like in different areas. They looked at road maps of France, travel guides that had things like advice about Michelin-starred restaurants in. But one of the biggest ways was that the Allies actually put out an appeal on BBC Radio and asked British people to send in their family postcards and photographs of Europe. And they expected a few thousand to come in, but in the end several million were sent in. And these are absolutely fascinating. They show all sorts of things like how steep beaches were, what the sea walls were like, along with what fun fairs looked like in some places. But these all add together to give a really detailed picture of what the coastline of France looked like, which was really useful for the Allies in trying to work out where to land, because they had an idea of what they would be faced with and where. And the audio-visual show that you can see in this picture on the right, that shows a British staff officer who's giving a briefing, and what he does is explain the background to how the Allies have arrived at this point, the campaigns that have led to 1944, how they've gone about developing the plan, how complicated it was. But the point that he leaves everyone with is that the only unknown that the Allies have to deal with is the weather. So just after you've come into the entrance of this gallery, we've got a display called Set Europe Ablaze, and this is about what was happening in France in the period between 1940 and 1944. To begin with, the Allies, particularly Britain, knew that they weren't strong enough to land in France in a full-scale invasion, so Britain set up all kinds of special units to take the war to the enemy. Airborne forces, commandos, special operations executive, lots of organisations like that were able to launch raids and carry out reconnaissance and work with the French resistance. And we've got lots of really interesting objects in this section. The beret is a beret that was owned by Captain Pat Porteous, who won the Victoria Cross on the Dieppe raid in 1942. We've got a commando knife that you can see there. The map at the back of the display case is actually a silk escape map, and the idea of that is that you can actually roll it up and sew it into the hem of your trousers, and if it got wet it didn't matter, and you could just fold it up, and it was much more practical for someone who was a a secret agent or someone who was trying to escape than a paper map. And on the right hand side of the display case, the little boxes you can see, they're actually a biscuit tin radio, and the idea of that is it's a radio that could be hidden anywhere. It's broken down into two parts plus the headphones, and that was used by secret agents in the French Resistance to be able to listen into messages from Britain. Right, so this display is all about the Allied commanders who were in charge for D-Day. Left to right in the picture you can see Admiral Ramsay, who was the naval commander, Air Chief Marshal Tedder, who was the Deputy Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Commander. To the right of him, General Sir Bernard Montgomery, the Land Forces Commander for D-Day. And then to the right of him, Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh Mallory, who was the Air Forces Commander on D-Day. Now, it's quite commonly known that these commanders didn't always see eye to eye. It's probably not surprising because they all come from completely different service backgrounds, different nationalities in some cases. So, it's probably not surprising that there were moments where they didn't get on as well as they might have done. But it's important for us to remember they were planning a huge operation that was extremely complicated. So it's not surprising that there were difficult moments. But it's also a good example of people who didn't always see eye to eye and maybe didn't have much in common, still managing to work together to get a job done. That's a really important lesson from D-Day. So the preparations for D-Day involved all kinds of different people in many different countries. Years before D-Day, whole societies were gearing up for the operation and doing their bit for the war effort. And this included women, men, some cases children, servicemen, but also civilian workers like dockyard workers, people working in factories, the Bevin boys who were working down the mines. The war effort involved pretty much everyone in all of the countries involved, everyone doing their bit to support the war effort. In the display case here you can see some uniforms. These were worn by female servicemen who were serving in the British forces just before D-Day. And the vehicle you can see just to the right of the display case is a BARV. This is short for Beach Armoured Recovery Vehicle. This is one of the special tanks that was designed for D-Day, and it's a Sherman tank, like the normal ones that you see with turrets on and guns, but it's had its turret and gun removed, and it's been modified to basically be a breakdown vehicle for the beaches. So when tanks, other vehicles or landing craft break down on the beach, it could either pull them away or shunt them away. It's very rare as well, this vehicle. We believe there's only 3 of them left in existence. So we're really lucky to have in our collections loads of interesting objects about the period just before D-Day, when Allied troops were camped around the Portsmouth area and actually around all sorts of ports on the south coast. Often these servicemen sort of parked outside people's houses and made friends with them, went in for a bath, or people cooked them dinner. And in the process they've handed over all sorts of different interesting souvenirs which have found their way into our collections. And it's a great example of how the museum is, and D-Day actually is very much about people and all kinds of different people. So the story of D-Day doesn't start off the French coast on the 6th of June, it starts before, and it starts in Britain when all of these different people from so many different countries are meeting. So one of our most well-known objects is this coat that was owned by Betty White. Betty was a 5-year-old girl in Gosport at the time of D-Day, just across the harbour from Portsmouth, and she was given these badges by Allied troops before and after D-Day, who were queuing up in Gosport to go over to Normandy, and her mum sewed them onto her coat that you can see in the photograph here. And there's almost 100 badges on this coat. It's an amazing record of all the different troops that Betty must have met from all sorts of different countries, from Britain, America, Canada, France, Belgium, Poland. It's a great portrayal of how many different people were around in the area at the time. And it's a good example of how D-Day affected absolutely everyone, even 5-year-old girls like Betty. So another great object that we've got in the museum is this guidebook for American servicemen in Britain. Lots of different people from different nationalities were in Britain, many of them for the first time, and it must have been really interesting for them to arrive in a country that had been at war for almost 4 years. And this guidebook for American troops stresses very much things like British customs, so not thinking because a British person doesn't talk to you that they're being rude, just that they might be being reserved. And also explaining that the war had been going on for a while in Britain and that there were lots of things that you couldn't get hold of in Britain, like food and things like that. One of the best lines in it is this line that you can see here that we've actually used in the displays about tea and coffee. It says that the British don't know how to make a good cup of coffee, you don't know how to make a good cup of tea. It's an even swap. I suspect that's something that most people can relate to, although to be fair I don't drink tea or coffee, so I'm not sure myself. So the displays that you can see in this photograph are about some of the technology that was developed for D-Day. Such a difficult operation, the Allies made full use of all the different innovations, equipment, uniform and things that they could develop. The nearest display case that you can see in the bottom left corner, that shows some models of landing craft, of DD swimming tanks. Just behind that there's a display case that's got some specialist clothing, a camouflage parachute smock that you can just see the sleeve of, and flying boots, which were designed so that if pilots had to parachute out over enemy territory, they could just cut the fleece uppers off and it looked like they were wearing a normal pair of boots, so it would help them to escape without looking like Allied pilots in Germany or occupied France. And behind that at the back there's a display case all about the Mulberry Harbours and the Pluto pipeline, which were huge engineering projects and really important to D-Day. And the bike that you can see hanging from the ceiling in the top centre part of the photo, that's a folding bike that was developed during the war for British servicemen, the idea being that it could fold up and take up less space in landing craft and gliders, so when troops landed they could unfold it, get on and get away, and have some mobility without having to take bigger, larger, heavier vehicles with them. So in the run-up to D-Day, the Allies carried out all sorts of reconnaissance of the beaches in Normandy, going over to check sand samples and things like that. The suit that you can see in this display case at the back is called a COP suit, which is short for Combined Operations Pilotage Parties. Now these were a unit who went ashore before D-Day at night, often going over on things like midget submarines and then creeping ashore and collecting sand samples, so the Allies would know how firm beaches were and what parts of beaches could carry heavier vehicles like tanks and things like that. The thing that you can see at the bottom of that display case at the back is called a suitcase radio, and the idea is that this is a radio that agents could carry with them, and it wouldn't look suspicious because it was in a suitcase. I've picked this up several times and I can tell you it's very, very heavy. It probably would have looked suspicious because it's that heavy. Whoever's carrying it might have been walking with a limp, but it's an idea of how the Allies were trying to use all these ideas to help them and the French resistance gather information. And further up in that display case you can see some examples of aerial photographs that were taken by aircraft before D-Day. The Allies took millions of aerial photographs of the French coast and beyond, so they had a really good detailed background picture of what the Germans were doing and what the defences looked like and what they would be facing on D-Day. So there are lots of things to touch and play with in the museum. This interactive in this photo here shows an aerial photograph of Weestrum, which is just inland from Sword Beach, and the idea is that you have to find the beach defences using a magnifying glass. These are things like gun batteries, trenches, barbed wire, things like that, and it's exactly what the Allied planners would have been doing just before D-Day, which would help the troops to know who were going to land on that beach, exactly what they would be facing. So this photograph shows the other half of the preparations gallery. At the back you can see a vehicle called a duck. This is a General Motors truck that's been made an amphibious truck, and the idea is that it could run on land and in water. This is another example of the sort of inventions that the Allies were coming up with, and thousands of these were made. The glider that you can see hanging from the ceiling, this is a model of a Horsa glider, and this was actually designed by Airspeed in Portsmouth, who were based at Portsmouth Airport, and it played a really important role in landing Allied troops, airborne troops on D-Day and during operations like Market Garden and the Rhine crossing. In the middle of the photograph, on the floor, you can see a model of the Atlantic Wall, and this shows some of the defences that the Allies faced on D-Day. It's actually a tactile model as well, so when you visit the museum you can touch it and really get an idea of what the troops faced on D-Day when they landed. So to the left of the photo, what you can see are displays about what was happening in France at the time. Starting at the back near the duck, this is about the German defences known as the Atlantic Wall. So we've got some objects like minefield markers and things like that, and a flamethrower from the Atlantic Wall. The next display case to the left is all about the German defenders, and this includes some personal objects such as service books of German troops, and it shows that they all came from very different backgrounds actually, and it gives us an idea of the sort of life they were living in France just before D-Day. And then finally on the left hand side of the photo, that display is all about the French people who'd been living under occupation since 1940. What was life like for them in the run up to D-Day? Okay, so these are some of the objects that are on display in this part of the museum. The big poster was actually displayed around France after 1940, after the fall of Dunkirk. And it shows a British officer in the background looming over a dishevelled French soldier who looks like he's really been through some rough moments. And the text at the bottom translates to "The English did this to us." And the idea of the poster was to try and turn French people against the Allies by making them feel that they were to blame by what had happened to France. And the photographs on the right, the top right photo shows a German serviceman whose service book we have in our collections and on display in the museum. His name was Werner Grugner, and his service book tells us a lot about his life and his background. It tells us that he was born in Wittenberg in Saxony, then he served on the Eastern Front in artillery regiments, and just before D-Day he was serving at an artillery school in France. And we know that after D-Day that artillery school was hurriedly turned into an artillery unit and sent to the front. What we don't know after that is what happened to Werner Grugner, and how his service book came to be in our collection, but it's something that we're trying to find out more about. It's a really interesting story about the participants of D-Day on the other side. So that completes our virtual tour of the Preparations Gallery, the first part of the D-Day story. Keep an eye out for the rest of our virtual tour soon. And in the meantime, let us know if there's anything else that you'd like to know about any of the displays or objects that we've just talked about. And please do keep an eye on our social media at the moment. We're trying to put out as much as we can. But in the meantime, goodbye from all of us at the museum, and please take care. We'll see you soon.